Good afternoon. Welcome to our webinar for today, Behavioral Healthcare Credentialing Done Right. Credentialing for mental health and substance use disorder programs. Our moderators today are Carol Gorbett from Arizona, Joyce Wagner from AZZLY. Our panelists today are Schaneaka Roberts, Angela Schreiber, and we will begin the webinar. If you have any questions for the panelists, please enter them through the Q&A feature on Zoom. We will have time at the end of this webinar where we will answer these questions as well as those that were sent in prior to the webinar. Our objectives today are to help you understand the unique differences in credentialing a mental health or substance use organization or provider, how commercial insurance networks work, improve revenue via coding based on staff credentials, what are the most critical steps involved in credentialing, what happens if credentialing is not done correctly. I am Joyce Wagner, Director of Revenue Cycle Management Services at AZZLY. I am excited to introduce our moderator and panel for today's webinar. Thank you for joining us today for the Behavioral Health Credentialing Done Right webinar. AZZLY is proud to offer these free educational webinars to support best practices. Carol Gorbett is owner of Expert Credentialing Services in Arizona. Carol is a credentialing expert with 20 years of experience with a specialty in behavioral healthcare credentialing. Expert Provider Credentialing Services motto is, "Let us power through the paperwork." Carol has been assisting AZZLY providers in their certification needs. Carol will be joined by two additional panelists. Schaneaka Roberts oversees operations at the Commitment House, a substance use disorder treatment program headquartered in Elizabethtown, Kentucky, with over 20 years of experience in medical billing and nearly 5 years specializing in substance use and mental health billing, licensing, and credentialing for facilities throughout Kentucky and expansion into Indiana. We have again first witnessed Schaneaka at work and her success with credentialing. Next, Angela Schreiber is the owner-founder of MedPro Billing and Consulting in Evansville, Indiana. MedPro provides billing and credentialing services for behavioral health providers across the United States. MedPro serves clients throughout the United States, with over 80% of them being behavioral health providers. Angela and her staff provide credentialing services to now a customer of AZZLY. With the introduction out of the way, I will turn it over to Carol Gorbett.
Thank you so much. Thanks everybody for being here. So, what is credentialing and why is it so important? Credentialing is an action-packed word. As a single word, it has emerged to define a very, very important process. So the act of credentialing verifies your staff's ability to legally provide the services offered to a patient, and this is based on federal and state mandates, and contractually meet the defined requirements of your insurance payers. There can be no shortcuts in the credentialing process, and I know at times it can seem very overwhelming. So let's go ahead and get to the meat and let's begin. So I'm going to ask Schaneaka the first question, and that is, what is credentialing And is there a checklist that you work with?
Okay. Credentialing refers to the process of verifying and evaluating the qualifications, training, education, and experience of individuals or organizations in order to ensure their credibility and competency in particular fields or profession. The credentialing process typically involves a thorough review of an individual or organization's credentials, which may include degrees, certifications, licenses, professional memberships, work history, and references. The purpose is to confirm that the individual or organization meets the established standards and requirements for the specific field. I have 4 steps that I use as a checklist for credentialing. The first one is to determine the purpose. Clearly define the purpose of the credentialing process and the specific qualifications or standards that need to be met. Second, identify the credentialing requirements. Determine the specific criteria, qualifications, or credentials that individuals or organizations need to possess. This includes educational degrees, certification, licenses, years of experience, or other relevant factors. Third, gather documentation. Request the necessary documentation from the individuals or organizations being credentialed. This may include copies of diplomas, certificates, licenses, and liability insurance policies. And fourth, review and verification. Thoroughly review and verify the submitted documentation to ensure its accuracy. This may involve contacting educational institutions, licensing boards, or previous employers to verify credentials and their references.
Thank you, Schaneaka. Yeah, there's a lot involved in the process, and it just keeps the more time goes on, it seems like the payers need more information. So Angela, this is to you. In your own words, why is credentialing important? What if you don't become credentialed?
Yeah, credentialing, contracting, it is important for a lot of reasons. And most of those we've talked about already, and we'll talk about even throughout the webinar. But one thing that is that it adds a layer of protection for the providers and the business. Another important reason that I think is overlooked sometimes in behavioral health is that it helps to establish an environment of trust with your patients before you even meet them. You're giving them that opportunity to know that you have been vetted by the insurance companies, that you have gone through the right channels, that while they're going through these traumatic events, that they have a safe place to go. Now, if you choose not to become credentialed or contracted with the payers, it could limit the opportunity to provide services to those patients because they're going to be required to go to an in-network provider. And then from the business side, not being contracted, you're relying on self-pay patients. It could be a financial hardship for those patients where they are no longer, they'll have to terminate services early before they're ready, or even look at racking up a large bill that they'll be unable to satisfy. My client relations manager, he likes to say, everything in life is hard, so choose your hard. While credentialing and contracting is hard, frustrating, do the work up front, take the frustrations up front, it will pay off in the long run and you'll see your businesses thrive.
Excellent. Very good points there. So Schaneaka, to you, what is the difference between credentialing a mental health substance abuse facility versus providers that work there?
Okay, so credentialing a mental health facility and a substance abuse facility involves assessing and verifying the qualification standards and compliance with specific guidelines. While both similarities, there are some differences as well. With the mental health, they focus more on mental health, primarily dealing with the diagnosis, treatment, and support for individuals with mental health disorders. Mental health facilities typically require appropriate licenses based on their jurisdiction and regulations. These licenses ensure that the facility meets specific standards for delivering the mental health services. As far as substance abuse facility primarily deal with the diagnosis, treatment, and support for individuals struggling with substance abuse disorders and addictions. And the substance abuse facility typically require license specific to substance abuse treatment programs. And these licenses ensure compliance also with the regulations related to the provision of addiction treatment and services. As far as establishing the credentialing for substance abuse facility involves assessing the qualifications, credentials, license of professionals specialized in addiction treatment. And as for mental health, of course, it's more as far as the mental health adhere to regulations and guidelines and standards bodies as far as the mental illness, and along with the substance abuse and mental health services administration for the local mental health authorities.
Great, awesome. Angela, how long does the process take, the credentialing process?
That's a pretty loaded question.
I know.
Depending on the time of year, the payer, state to state, it can vary drastically. We tell our clients here at MedPro that to anticipate 3 to 6 months. Some payers do move quickly. We've seen things come back in 30 days or quicker. And then we've seen some of the smaller payers that take up to 6 months. So it varies, like I said, drastically, but we do try and get things moving as quickly as possible. And that's where, Schaneaka said the checklist, things to work with, making sure you have all your ducks in a row. That is so important when you start the process.
Very true. Very true. Thanks. Schaneaka, how often would a provider need to do re-credentialing or any sort of updates?
Okay, so the frequency of re-credentialing or updates for a provider can vary depending on several factors, including the specific requirements of the credentialing organization, the provider specialty, the policies of the healthcare facility or insurance plan they are affiliated with. Generally, re-credentialing is performed at regular intervals to ensure that providers maintain the necessary qualifications and meet the standards of their profession. So for commercial health plans, typically they're required to go through the credentialing process initially when they join the network. And afterwards, re-credentialing is usually conducted like every 1 to 3 years, depending on the plan's policy, which they will go over that in the contract prior to signing that. And for Medicaid, typically requires providers to re-credential every 5 years in order to maintain being a billable provider. And it is important for providers to stay informed about the specific re-credentialing requirements to the organization they're affiliated with to ensure they meet the necessary deadlines and maintain their credentials, because it's very important.
Right. Yeah, it is. And this is a good question for you, Angela, since you know both sides of billing and credentialing.
Yeah.
What are most common reasons for provider credentialing denials?
Yeah. There's numerous reasons out there. Kind of the big 3 that we see is, the provider has not met the state licensing requirements. CAQH, a lot of payers are now pulling from CAQH and really utilizing that. So making sure all your information is accurate, up to date. You have your resume history, that you're answering the questions accurately, the yes and no questions on there. Those are all important things because payers do catch it, they will question, and that delays everything. The other thing is if a network is closed, we can submit applications, and sometimes if the payers feel that they've got enough members or providers in that area, they will close the network, and it doesn't mean that you're not eligible to be in it later. It's just at this time they're not taking new providers.
Great. Okay. To Schaneaka, what needs to be done if a new provider is added to an organization?
Okay, to add a new substance abuse provider to an organization, You will need to ensure that that new substance abuse provider meets all the necessary licensing and accreditation requirements. This typically is obtained through the appropriate license and certification verification. After the license and certification is verified, the provider will need to be linked to the organization. And there are 2 steps basically that I use to link a provider to an organization. For Medicaid, the provider will need to be added in the Medicaid partner portal. And then as for commercial plans, each individual commercial payer has its own application and enrollment process, and that will individually need to be completed and submitted to that particular commercial payer.
All right, thank you for that. Angela, if a provider is previously credentialed by a former employee, does that provider need to be re-credentialed?
So we come across this often here at MedPro, and providers tend to think that they can leave one group on Friday and they can start in a new group on Monday and everything be good to go. That is absolutely not the case. I can't stress that enough. You know, there are different payers and state requirements on how that process changes hands from one tax ID to another. Some payers will require you to just do a demographic change, and that is it. Others will require you to go through the whole process again, that 3 to 6 months. So we encourage, if you are looking to make a change, that you give yourself as much lead time as possible. Always keep that 3 to 6 month time frame in the back of your mind, because it is so critical. Like I said, I can't stress it enough to give yourself as much lead time as possible when looking at making a change from one tax ID to another, or even going from changing locations, changing your address. You may be staying with the same group, but even if it's just moving a location and address change, everything will have to be updated with the insurance, and all those requirements and processes take different time.
So true. And it's a misconception out there that providers think if they work at one place and go to another place that all good to go.
Yep.
Yep. No. All right. Thank you, Angela. So Schaneaka, how do commercial insurance work? What happens when they receive a provider enrollment application?
Okay, so commercial insurance networks are also known as the preferred provider organization, and they are networks of healthcare providers and facilities that have contracted with an insurance company to provide medical services to its members at contracted rates. Okay, so here's a general overview of how commercial insurance networks work. First, contracted insurance companies, they negotiate contracts with the individual provider. These contracts are outlined the terms and conditions of reimbursement rates, services covered, and other arrangements. For as a provider network, once the contracts are in place, the insurance company established a network of participating providers, and these providers agree to accept the insurance company's negotiated rates for services that have been rendered to its members. Now, what happens when a commercial insurance receives a provider enrollment? When a commercial insurance company receives a provider enrollment, it typically goes through a series of processes and verifications to determine whether to accept the provider into its network. And here's a short overview of what typically happens. First, the application submission. The provider submits a provider enrollment application to the commercial insurance company. This application includes details about the provider's credentialing, license, specialties, practice location, and other relevant information. Second, an initial review is done. The insurance company performs an initial review of the application to ensure that all required information is provided. They check for completeness and verify that the provider meets the basic eligibility criteria. And third, credentialing and verification. The insurance company conducts a thorough credentialing process, which involves verifying the provider's qualification, education, training, license, certification, and professional references. They also review malpractice history and any disciplinary action and other relevant factors. And fourth, contract negotiation. If the provider passes the initial review, credentialing and network adequacy assessments, the insurance company may enter into a contract negotiation with the provider. This involves discussion reimbursement rates, terms and conditions, and other contractual details. And fifth, last thing, the contract approval. Once both parties reach an agreement, the insurance company reviews and approves the contract. And as long as the provider is in agreement, the contract is signed and you have your commercial insurance enrollment done.
All right.
Probably commercial's a lot.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Schaneaka. And then Angela, can revenue be improved via coding based on staff credentials?
Absolutely. You know, not all payers take a reduction based on your license type or give you any extra reimbursement, but it is always important to, if your license type does change, that you make sure you let each payer know so that they can update their records, update the directory so that your appropriate license type is reflected. You know, here in the state of Indiana, if you have an LCSW, then they do, for Medicaid, there is a fee reduction on the allowable because they are considered a mid-level provider versus, you know, your doctors, your psychologists who get that full reimbursement. So any license type change, always make sure that you have that information updated, CAQH, so that it can be passed on to the payers and all your information with them can be updated in directories.
All right. Thank you both for sharing all that valuable information and your experiences. Now I will turn it back to Joyce so we can address the many questions received by the attendees during registration. Sorry.
Thank you, Carol. I want to engage you in answering some questions submitted by registrants to get your input as well as questions that have come in today. We're going to start with, is it best to credential clinicians individually or also credential the agency as a provider?
That's a loaded question because in the credentialing world, there are so many variables and so many factors. I recommend to credential as a quote unquote group, even though it's one provider, you want to credential the type 1 NPI and their type 2 NPI together as a business. That way, if the provider wants to grow and add other providers in their group, they're already set up as a group. So I always recommend to credential / contract as a group versus individual.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Any tips for faster credentialing?
I had a client say to me one time, and I thought this was just brilliant and wonderful question. She said, she asked me a whole bunch of questions, but she said to me, what can slow down this process? What could hinder this process? And I said, that's an excellent question. Not giving me all the information that I need. The checklist I've seen in 20 years of doing this has grown. It used to be I just needed a few documents, and now I need, tons of stuff to get started. So getting all that information right away, up front, all of it, not just a few things, all the information will help the credentialer credential faster, quicker. And I would just say that's the main thing. The AQH username and password, diploma information, resume, and month-year format. Just everything on that credentialing checklist given to your credentialer will help speed up the process.
Thank you. What are the advantages to hiring a credentialing specialist versus handling it on your own?
I get this question a lot too, and it's just become a specialized field, especially with the jargon and the terms. A credentialer knows what to say to a payer to, get that application pushed through. And a lot of times I've had instances where providers do it themselves, and then they start getting denials and billings all messed up. So they come to me to unravel it and fix everything. So you want it done right the first time. You don't want to have to go back and try and fix some things that the payer's done, basically because they didn't know any better. They are just going to take the information that you give them and process it. So you want someone to do it correctly the first time so you can bill successfully.
So that's a good segue into my next question, because
Okay.
being in charge of revenue cycle management for AZZLY, I see this every single day of the week where claims are denied because they credentialed in the wrong specialty. So talk to me a little bit about that and the importance of having an in-depth discussion with the people about what kind of claims they're going to be sending. And so what specialty, what do they need to do to make that credentialing successful so they have a very high first-time pass rate when their claims are submitted?
Right. Yes, great question. So this again is why you have a credentialer do this, because there are some providers who have a specialty and are board certified in a certain specialty, but then think they can do other things. Like a psychiatrist can't, do chiropractic care or cardiologist care. So the board certification drives the training. You have to credential the provider based on their degree, based on any certifications they have. And I want to also add that just because the credentialer submitted the information to the payers doesn't mean the payer loads the information correctly. I just had a case where the provider was a nurse practitioner psych, but the payer mistakenly loaded her as a psychologist. She's not a psychologist. So don't blame your credentialer when payers load the wrong information in. And that's part of a credentialer's job too, is to, fight with the insurance company and say, hey, you loaded this incorrectly and we're getting denials. So can you fix it? But yeah, so specialty is very important. And like I said, their certification, their degree, their board certs, that drives the train as far as how they're going to be credentialed.
Thank you. Why is it so difficult for payers to follow through after you submit the forms?
Yeah, that's also a good question. One of the things that I've seen over the years is they are extremely overwhelmed, just like the rest of us, right? In this industry, you have some payer representatives who are covering a huge territory. You may have one person doing Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, and they have to process information for all those states, thousands and thousands of applications and contracts. And so it is very difficult when you submit things, and it's frustrating when you submit information and the payers are taking such a long time. Again, this is why you hire someone to do your credentialing, because that is all they do. We are in the trenches fighting with the insurance companies to get them to move the application along. And we're constantly sending emails and calls and getting to the right person when the provider just needs to concentrate on patient care.
And how often should a facility or an individual provider be re-credentialed?
Often, is that what you said? How often they need to be? Okay, sorry about that. It depends on the specialty. It depends on the payer. I think we were talking about this before. It's anywhere between 1 and 3 years for recredentialing.
And as a credentialer, is part of what service you offer to your clients the ability for you to track when that recredentialing needs to be done?
Yeah, so your credentialer should always keep the CAQH up to date. That is very important. It has to be attested it depends on the state, anywhere between 90 to 120 days. Some states say 180 days, but you want to always keep the information current, attested, have the license, the malpractice insurance, everything up to date, because that is going to help facilitate the recredentialing process.
Thank you, Carol, Schaneaka, and Angela for joining us today. We have several questions, or many questions, that we didn't have time to answer. We're going to be sending out responses to all who attended and who have sent in questions after the webinar. And if you still have questions, please reach out to AZZLY at hello@azzly.com. Once again, Carol Gorbett from expertcredentialservice.com, Schaneaka Roberts at thecommitmenthouse.com, and Angela Schreiber at clientrelations@medprobc.com. Be sure to follow us on Eventbrite to stay up to date on our webinars. We thank you for attending today. We're going to continue to offer webinars on topics relevant to behavioral health care and addiction treatment. If you'd like more on credentialing and a more in-depth webinar, be sure to let us know at hello@azzly.com, and we will happily help you. Thank you and goodbye.